presentation really, but what I thought I'd do is I'll talk about shamelessly I'll plug my book, which is like 2 years old now. I'll pass the copies around if you want to have a look at it.
Thank you.
And there's a discount flyer as well, hard sell. Okay, I thought
what's the book called, Paul? Excuse me. What's the book called?
Well, it's called Regeneration. It's Discontents, Public Housing, Place and Inequality in London. And I suppose it's kind of it's 500 pages long. This is the short version, by the way. The publishers were kind of like, you know, the original one was 200,000, so they wouldn't have 200,000 words. They didn't want that. Anyway, so the book is based on. I started the research for the book back in 2007, and then the main part of the research was from about 2012 up until about 2018. Basically, I finished research in 2019. And the point about the book is that what it tries to do is it tries to provide an overview of what's happened to council housing, basically in London, particularly in relationship to regeneration. So, just to say a bit about my background. I mean, I'm currently It's like the song from Tommy. There's more at the door. Who remembers that? Shows my age. Yeah, I'd say about my background. I mean, I'm currently Professor of Urban Studies at Birkbeck. I'm going to be there for the next 3 months. I and several other of my colleagues, I don't know if anybody's heard about Birkbeck, but it's had a kind of a bit of a, I can put it, meltdown. And over 100 staff are leaving. It's, anyway, including me. So I'm finishing in July. I'm Professor of Urban Studies in the Department of Geography. In terms of my personal background is that, you know, I grew up in Halifax in Yorkshire, and the book is dedicated to my parents because they got council housing when they needed it. Mm-hmm. What happened is that we lived in a back-to-back terraced house in Halifax in Yorkshire. We lived opposite a factory. But it was an unmodernised house. There was outside toilet. I know this sounds totally free Yorkshireman, but that's what it was actually. What happened is my dad got very ill, so my parents applied for a council flat basically, and they got a council flat in Halifax. So we moved into a council maisonette when I was 12 basically, and then my dad died there 6 years later. My mum, she moved to a council flat in Halifax. And a few years ago, I went on a sentimental journey back to Halifax with my wife, and we went to my old back-to-back terraced house, and the street was still there. The street's still there, the factory's still there, but it's actually closed down. So then we went up to the council maisonette, which is 3 miles out of town. It was an out-of-town estate, basically. And when we got there, I thought, hang on a minute, something's happened. Where's the estate? What happened is, and this is very relevant to the Aylesbury, is that about 15 years ago, there was a stock transfer. So the Halifax Council then stock transferred all of its stock from the council ownership into housing association ownership. So it became a housing association property, and then eventually the housing association demolished it. But a bit like parts of the Aylesbury, some of the blocks were empty for years and years and years, despite the fact that, you know, Halifax, like many places, has got a waiting list. So, I did my PhD. My PhD was looking at Camden Council housing, so I did a research on the history of Camden Council housing and sort of like the sociology of Camden Council housing. What was it like living in Camden Council housing? And then from that, I got interested in the issues around stock transfer. And this is kind of like, probably, I know Jerry will know a lot about this, and Ison, and some people will know a lot about this, but this is kind of like quite important to what happened really in terms of the history of council housing in London in particular. So what happened is that back in 1988, under Thatcher, the Conservatives introduced this scheme whereby they wanted to what's called demunicipalise. They didn't like councils, they didn't like the state. Mm-hmm. So what they did was that they said to council tenants, you could transfer to a housing association landlord if you vote for it. And there was a whole series of ballots were held about this. So from 1988 until 1997, there was quite extensive stock transfer programme. So, Halifax, for example, but not many in London. There was actually only one council in London which stock transferred, and that was Bromley. So if you look at Bromley now, Bromley's got no council housing. That's because they stock transferred it to the Housing Association. Now, then what happens is this, and this was a Tory policy basically. Thatcher, it was kind of like, I suppose it's like a collective version of the right to buy. The right to buy was the transfer, individual privatisation of homes. But what stock transfer was basically a collective shift away from the council towards these new housing association landlords. But the tenants had a vote. It's important to have a vote. Now, what then happens is this, and part of the book talks quite a lot about Labour, New Labour in particular, because my view is that you can debate New Labour, whether it was good, bad, certainly bad in terms of foreign policy, obviously, but you could argue about their kind of social policy. Certainly they did some good things about education, but in terms of housing, I think they were disastrous in many kind of ways. And in particular, what they did was that they pursued and deepened the previous stock transfer policy. Now what they did, they did two things. It's quite important to understand this. So the first thing was that they introduced something called the Decent Homes Programme. Because if you go back to 97 when Labour got in, there was something like an estimated £19 billion worth of backlog of maintenance across the social housing stock in England. So so basically there's massive disinvestment in the stock. So what happened then is that New Labour, they said, okay, so we introduced this thing called the Decent Homes Programme, which was saying we want these we want each social home to have new bathrooms, windows, kitchens, basically. So it's an internal works programme of internal, and in many ways that was a good thing because it's like a reinvestment in the stock. Now, in London at that point in time in 1997, what happened is if you look across the council stock, very high proportions of London Council housing failed to meet the Decent Homes standard. So in Camden, it was probably one of the worst. About 95% of Camden Council housing failed to meet the Decent Homes standard. So basically then Labour said, okay, we want you to improve the homes to this new standard. But we're not going to give the councils any money. It was a key political decision. So they said, we're not going to give the money directly to the councils. The reasons for that, one is that, well, two reasons. One is ideological. Blair, in particular, didn't really like local government for all kinds of reasons. He had a bad example of Hackney, for example, which he often talked about. But the other reason is economic, fiscal, is that basically, if you remember, Gordon Brown was at the Treasury. And so what Brown was very, very key back in 1997 to make sure that that he was in control of public finances. So the argument was that if they gave them, if the central government gave the money directly to the councils, that would potentially be inflationary. And Blair was a control freak, the Treasury was a control freak, so they didn't want to do that. So they didn't want to give the money directly to the councils, but they had this target, this Decent Homes Programme. So what they said to the councils, and by the way, this is London, most of inner London, huge proportion of council housing, particularly in inner London. So at its peak, Tower Hamlets in 1981 had 82% of all the stock in Tower Hamlets was council housing. In Southwark, where we are now, 2/3. So two-thirds of the whole of the housing stock in Southwark was council housing. It's quite astonishing, really. And I think just a bit of a digression on that, but I think it's very important as well to think about the speciality of council housing in London. Because if you think about, again, a lot of comparisons have been drawn between public housing, what's called the projects in the US. There's a very famous project called the Robert Taylor Homes Project, which is basically in the south side of Chicago, which is actually demolished now. But if you look at the American projects, they were kind of like, they were often set apart by major expressways from the rest of the city. Now, London is not like that at all. You walk around any of the inner London boroughs and you will come across council housing. It's not over there, It's in here. So it's really key and central to the way that the city was developed. I think I could say
Mixed communities.
yes, yes. Yeah, I'll just digress on that in a minute. Does anyone know why was there so much council housing in London? This is the sort of question I ask my students. One of my students is here, so I'm not going to let her answer this.
You're bombing, wasn't it?
Partly. Partly. Why is okay? If you look at a map of Paris and you look at a map of London, they're opposites in terms of housing. So if you look at in a Paris, there's hardly any public housing, any social housing. The social housing in Paris is mainly on the peripheral arrondissement, and then beyond that in the banlieue. That's where most of the social housing is in Paris. London is entirely the opposite. So in London then you have a very high proportion of, as I said, council public housing, social housing in the inner core, and relatively little on the outer. God, this is a question I set my students. Can you think why? Bomb is partly, but it's not the only reason.
Because the outer London boroughs resisted it.
Yeah, why did they?
The Tories.
Yeah. Yeah. It's political. So, one of the key things is that historically, certainly up until New Labour anyway, this city, the way that public housing has developed is it's very much linked up to party politics. So, in particular, what happened is that from 1934 up until 1965, you had what was called the London County Council. So that was the metropolitan-wide authority. They dealt with housing. Now the LCC from that period, from a 30-year period, was always Labour. Okay, so this is quite unprecedented. So Labour, and again, Labour had more control over housing in inner London than any national Labour government has ever done. So you had a 30-year period whereby the LCC, as it was called, under Herbert Morrison, and they were able to build many of the estates. So they built something like roughly about 250,000 homes, basically. That's one of the reasons. And then also, if you look at the Inner London Council, so for example, if you look at St Pancras. St Pancras again was Labour Council, and again, one of their pitch basically to the working class voters of Inner London was, you're living in shitty housing, because a lot of it was slum housing, slum landlordism. So basically then, we will provide public housing on the rates. And that's what they did. So they were, so Labour was, in my view, and took it out in the book, it was a really progressive kind of moment in many ways. Yes, you can query the kind of like the design of it. Some of it wasn't terribly well built in the first place, but nevertheless, it was a really, really progressive, movement in many ways. And then after the LCC was then eradicated back in 1965, then you get the creation of the GLC, and the GLC then covers the whole of the rest of the outer London as well. The GLC also built quite a lot of council housing. So again, if you look at the politics of it, it's very clear that the inner London boroughs, primarily Labour, that's where the public housing was located. And you're quite right in the sense that many of the outer London boroughs, Tory boroughs, they didn't want council housing. They regarded it as a blight. And there's studies done about the sort of stigmatisation that people living, for example, at the Barking and Dagenham at the time. So you can see all that sort of stuff going on. Yeah. So let's go back then to the whole sort of so historically, I argue in the book that Labour has played a really, really key progressive role, certainly up until the 80s and 90s, in terms of the provision of housing. I don't think they were always fantastic at managing it. And we can discuss that. There was clearly mismanagement in certain cases. Hackney, for example, very poor manager of its stock, basically. Anyway, so let's just go then back to the stock transfer story then. So what then happens then in 97 is, as I said, then Blair didn't really terribly get local government, and then Brown was a centraliser. He didn't want to spend the money. They realised then that the stock was hadn't been invested in, so they introduced a Decent Homes programme, but they weren't prepared to give the money directly to the councils. So what they did was that they introduced what was called the 3 options. So this was what councils had. So the first option was that the council could transfer the stock from the council ownership to a housing association. The second option was what was called PFI, Private Finance Initiative. So you set up this really complex sort of, financial arrangement. The stock then gets moved out into that, and then the PFI provides the money to do the stock. The third option was what's called ALMOs. Do you know what ALMO stands for?
Arm's Length Management Organisation.
Arm's Length Management Organisation.
And what's the difference between an ALMO and an SPV?
The difference is that the ALMO was the council still retains the ownership of it, but the management functions get devolved out to this new sort of entity. SPVs are they're more independent of the council in fiscal terms, basically. So it's not quite as tied in.
Our SPV is being taken back into the council.
Yeah, a lot of. I mean, some of the SPVs. Is that your Croydon?
No. He went on to Croydon after Lambeth. We're Lambeth.
You're Lambeth. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Home
What's
for
the SPV stand for?
Special Purpose Vehicle. Sorry.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. It's a little bit different, but
Yeah, but it was still.
yeah. So basically then, so most councils, so this then you get this position then in the 90s up until then, until 2010. So this is one of the things that I got really interested in was what was happening in terms of stock transfers. And what was interesting was that across the country, there was only actually about a quarter of stock transfers which didn't actually happen, but in London there was actually a third. So there was generally more resistance against transfers in London. And of course, as anybody looking at this Aylesbury itself, the original Regeneration scheme, which is New Deal communities, that involved a stock transfer to a housing association, and that was when Eisen and residents on the estate opposed that. That was actually, I think it was one of the biggest ballots in London against stock transfer. 74% people voted against it, so retained it in the council ownership. Another example is if you look at the Boundary Estate. Does anyone know the Boundary Estate? Boundary Estate's the oldest London council estate. It's in present day Tower Hamlets near Bethnal Green, basically. 90% of tenants at the Boundary Estate voted against transfer. So basically then, so you have this sort of position then. So New Labour did this, but so they kind of said the councils were kind of hamstrung really, because they had big stocks, so they got big stock. Camden got big stocks, but they didn't have any money to do it unless they went through all of these kind of really complex kind of like arrangements, basically. So yeah, but the other thing that Labour didn't do, and this is again a bit geeky, but there you go, this is all true. If you look at Council House building, this is the thing that New Labour were spectacularly bad at. So this is a question again that I asked my students. So in the 10 years then that Tony Blair was in government from 1997 to 2007, you want to have a guess at how many council homes were built in London?
0.
Close. 280.
Oh.
A 10-year period.
280.
80.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not
So-
280,000.
So, if you again, I've got the charts in the book. You can have a look at the book, but you can see if you look at all the other periods of when Labour was in government. So if you look at then the period in 1945 to 51, the Attlee government. They built about 1 million council homes across the country. And that was at a time of austerity. Under Wilson, tens of thousands of council homes were built every year in London, and again under the Wilson and Callaghan governments back in the 1970s. So New Labour did something totally different. They basically sort of invested in the existing stock, but they didn't build anymore. And one of the ironies is, under Thatcher, Thatcher was in power from 79 to 89. There were 50,000. There were 50,000 council homes built in London. So there were 50,000 more council homes built under Thatcher than there were under Blair. If Blair could have built the same number of council homes as Thatcher had, you would virtually have nobody in temporary accommodation in this city.
Wow.
It was just a catastrophic failure.
Wow.
So New Labour basically, and again they kind of bought into the kind of conservative stuff about, we want to have, it was all based around housing associations, trumpeting housing associations, what housing associations. I remember going to meetings at that point in time for my sins. I was, involved in a campaign called Defend Council Housing. And I remember going to meetings with Labour politicians, senior Labour politicians, people in the city. And, their argument was, it really doesn't matter whether it's councils or housing associations.
I remember that.
That was basically the line. And they blurred the difference. They said it's all social housing. They blurred the line. And, it was never going to be the case. It was clearly never going to be the case that housing associations were able to step up to the plate. So now you've got this kind of really bizarre position now, is that after all of these kind of decades, you're talking about 4 decades of failure. Now you have Labour councils in London suddenly saying, aha, we have to build council housing. We have to solve the housing crisis. Well, yeah, it's kind of good, but it's kind of 40 years too late in a way, basically. And the irony is, of course, that one of the ways that I was at Hackney Council last night actually talking about state regeneration, but the irony is that one of the ways that they say we're going to solve the housing crisis is, guess what? Yeah, demolish the existing estates and build new mixed tenure estates. This will solve the housing crisis. And clearly, it ain't going to do that, basically. The finance of this is quite simple. Basically, again, if you go back historically, councils could borrow from the Public Loans Board, but also there's a substantial central government grant, which would facilitate then the gap between the cost of building the property and the rental value that you could get from it. It's no grant. So, well, there's a bit of money from the Mayor of London, but, in terms, again, in historical terms, there isn't the money to do this. So what councils are basically, forced into, or depending on what your perspective, is that essentially then they say, well, we have no option. We have to get into bed with a private developer, or we have to set up our own kind of like vehicle, as with the SPV in Lambeth, as with New and Poplar, as with Hackney, and basically then the council will be the developer and will then build some private properties, and the private properties then will cross-subsidise then any new building of any new social homes. Again, without substantial central government grants to do that, it's a tall order, basically. And in the meantime, again, I've got thinking about London councils. London councils are different. I think some are better than others. I live in Islington. I actually think Islington are not bad. Probably, well, not bad. They're the least worst. Probably one of the least worst councils. But round the corner from where I live, their strategy is exactly to build these new private homes, and then that will cross-subsidise. Round the corner from where I live, there are 16 empty private buildings that have been empty, I reckon, for about 18 months, 2 years. We can't sell them. They're going for about 700, 800 a pop.
Vauxhall is full of empty properties.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's a bit of preamble. So what I do in the book is, I got interested in stock transfer, so I looked at the Ocean Estate in Tower Hamlets, which was a stock transfer, and they were actually rejected the stock transfer back in 2005. And I also looked at the Cobham Park Estate in Lambeth, and that actually accepted the stock transfer back in 2005. So I was interested in kind of like the campaigns against that. And then gradually I got interested in the whole issue around estate regeneration. I started doing work as well, I should say, around the Olympics. So I got interested in the Olympics and regeneration. One of the things that I came across there when I was doing research on the Olympics, this is again going back to about 2010, was that there's an estate in Stratford which is in the epicentre of the kind of Olympics, and that estate is called the Carpenter's Estate. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. Some people might have heard of it here. It's a 700 unit estate. It's just right, literally next door to Stratford Station. And this was going through a very protracted estate regeneration programme. That goes back to 2005, basically. And so I went back to this. I think some people from Focus are here, actually. Are you here, Hannah and Aisha? Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. I thought I recognised you. Yeah, so Carpenter's Estate, this was then an estate which was supposed to be regenerated back in 2005. And there were various kind of issues on the estate. It's big, putting it in a simple story, there's 3 big tower blocks, and then there's low-rise blocks, and then quite a lot of terraced housing, basically. So the project began in 2005, and by the time that you get to around about 2012, 2013, the council had emptied half of the estate. Their development partner at the time was University College London. So they got into bed then with UCL, and basically then at the time UCL, what they were going to do was UCL, they're next to Birkbeck up in near Euston. UCL wanted to expand their campus. They couldn't do it in Camden because Camden Council generally don't like to have their council estates knocked down. So they went to Newham, and at the time Newham was run by Robin Wales, and Newham under Robin Wales was much more au fait and happy about the idea that UCL could come in on the site of a former council estate to knock down the estate. That was the Carpenter's Estate. Mm-hmm. So what they were going to, it's Carpenter's Estate, it's got a 23-acre estate, and basically then UCL were going to use that as the basis for their new campus. And there was a campaign against that. And I got involved in interested in the campaign and did sort of scholar activism, I suppose. And what happened there was that actually UCL pulled out. They pulled out the deal in 2013 for all kinds of reasons. Probably the fact that they were getting a lot of bad publicity from the fact that they're going to basically build a new campus on the site of a demolished council estate. Doesn't look too cool. UCL like to think of themselves as a progressive university, by the way. So, is there any UCL people here? So they pulled out. So I got interested in that. And then, gradually from about 2012, 13, 14, right all the way up to 2019, I went to hundreds of meetings around London looking at estate regeneration. So I attended quite a lot of meetings at the Aylesbury estate. Then I looked at 14 different estates in London: Covent Park, Ocean Estate, West End in Barnet. We'll be down up in Hackney, North London up in Hackney. About 14 main estates. And the point about the book is really what I try and do is, because there's a lot of stuff been written about estate regeneration. There's a lot of it been written by what you can call the regeneration industry, and that's then the consultants, it's the local authorities, it's the housing associations, it's the developers. And if you look at, and I've read dozens of their reports, if you read their reports, they always say the same thing. They always say estate regeneration is absolutely fantastic because people are in these, and they often have before and after photographs. So you have a before photograph, and it's always black and white, and there's usually, I don't know, a bit of antisocial behaviour going on or whatever.
No plants.
No plants, no trees, there's never any trees. No. It all looks terribly grey and monochromatic and what have you. So this is the before, and then you have an after. And then it's, hey, presto, here we are in our brand new shiny flats. And I just watched a recent video which was done by, who's the developer here? Who is it?
It's Hill, isn't it?
This is Nottingham.
Yeah, no, I think it was them, yeah. But again, it's exactly that. It's exactly that. So they interview a few kind of people and say, it's all fantastic, blah, blah, blah. So, it struck me that, there's clearly a mismatch going on here, because what I'm kind of like hearing from residents at the meetings and in the interviews I interviewed, getting off 200 residents and estates, their stories and their narratives of what estate regeneration involves is fundamentally different to what the official regeneration narrative is. So that was really the point of doing the book, in a way, was basically to say, look, this is I'm trying to, shift the, if you being a bit academic here, but shift the epistemological gaze away from the kind of the industry towards residents' experiences on the ground. What's it like for them? So part of the book, first part of the book is really talking about the policy background. Second part of the book then is looking at estates before the regeneration happens. So, and what I do there is, I did oral history, basically kind of variant on oral history interviews. So I was basically saying to people, okay, so just tell me what was it, how did you get onto the estate? What was it like to live on the estate before the regeneration vehicle arrives? And what's it like now that regeneration's going on? So that's what I did. So basically the second part of the book, I'll simplify it if I can. Essentially what I found was that residents, and this is in many ways, this is kind of testimony to many of the findings that I had in the book. Residents had placed a lot of value on their homes and on the neighbourhoods that they lived in. So many of the people I interviewed, they'd lived on their estates for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Some people have lived on the estates all their lives. So they were embedded in the place. So they had a very much there's an insider's perspective about it. And they, many aspects of their homes, as you can see, this is a spacious flat, fantastic views. And many of the council homes were built at what's called Parker Morris standard, which is actually a high standard of internal space standard, basically. In terms of the neighbourhoods, what I found was that essentially, it's a matter of kind of longevity. People, they'd lived on the estates for many years, so they became familiar with their neighbours. Not necessarily that they were all going along to community meetings. It wasn't sort of like neighbourliness in the sense of formal kind of proceedings, formal kind of meetings. But it was just this sort of day-to-day meeting. And again, if you think about this block here when it was full, people you have to cross through. Not to get to your own front door. You have to cross by your neighbour's front window. So many of the old estates, again, if you look at the old LCC blocks, which were built in the 40s and 50s, they're sort of five-storey walk-up flats. It's very hard to be isolated. It's very actually difficult to be isolated in those spaces. There's always a constant process of movement. And the old LCC blocks, again, were designed around sort of internal courtyards. So again, in the summer, you look at the old blocks, people put their chairs outside on the balconies, kids play out. And then in the courtyards, then again, people put their chairs outside, sit outside. They're quite convivial spaces. So there's a lot that people valued about their homes. And again, you can clearly see that in Iceland's fantastic exhibition. However, there were issues, and you can't, again, I'm not somebody who says that, these were problem-free spaces. But the problems tended to arise due to external factors. And a lot of it was bound up with what the council or the housing association did in terms of management and repairs and maintenance. And I'd say, didn't do. Absolutely. And that was generally it was a familiar narrative that each estate that I went to. People, they liked, in some cases, they loved their homes, they liked their neighbourhoods, they often liked their neighbours. But they didn't like the fact that the council or the housing association were, laggard in doing the repairs. People had all kinds of stories about they have to ring up, can't get anything done. They come, they bodge it up, so it's that. The other issue that some people certainly had, and this was people probably more with families, I'd say, was that some people were overcrowded. So you had chronic overcrowding. So, I interviewed people, there's one woman at an estate up in, there's a guy that I interviewed up in Northumberland Park. Northumberland Park, this is an estate up in Tottenham. And basically then, he was an Uber driver, and lived with his wife and his kids. They had 2 kids, but they were on a 1-bed flat. So he'd been applying to Haringey Council to get a new property, and it simply wasn't happening. So, but that function of the overcrowding that's the result of 40 years failure to not build council housing. That's what it's a failure of. So you can understand that some people who were overcrowded said, do you know what, if I think that the demolition will get me a new, bigger home, then, I'll go for that. There were also the kind of issues as well. There's also issues around stigmatisation, and this is particularly the case in the estate that we're in here. Probably know this, but the Aylesbury estate became infamous through Tony Blair's visit. So 2 days after he became, I think Alison's got the photographs actually. A couple of days after he became elected back in 1997, he came down to the Aylesbury and he said, these places, these people have been socially excluded by 18 years of Conservative policy failures. So we then are going to re-include the Aylesbury estate and people who live on the Aylesbury estate. So that was his kind of sort of social thrust. But what's one of the interesting factors about the Aylesbury? So what happened then? Sorry, just say about the Aylesbury. So what then happened was that the New Labour, one of the things that they set up what's called the New Deal for Communities. So they looked at 39 neighbourhoods across England, 10 in London, which had high levels of deprivation. So there were 10 in London. So that included the Aylesbury in Southwark, it included Clapham Park in Lambeth, and it included the Ocean Estate in Tower Hamlets, basically. So many of the big estates across London were included in this New Deal for Communities programme. But the amount of money that they were giving to the New Deal was 50 mil. But by then, don't forget, the Aylesbury had no proper funding for years and years and years because of the defunding during the 18 years of the previous Conservative governments. So, by the time you get to 97, the estate definitely needed some reinvestment. The problem was the way that it was actually kind of like introduced, really. So Blair comes in 97. So what then happens is that with the Aylesbury is that in that particular case, so because there was a rejection, so the whole thing was based around the idea that you would stock transfer. So because they lost the stock transfer ballot in 2001, then there was no plan B. There was no plan B for this. So what then happened is Southwark Council back in 2005 took the decision then to say, okay, we're going to demolish. And at that point in time, there was no ballots for demolitions. There's a ballot now, but there wasn't back in 2001.
So residents wouldn't have a say.
2005.
In 2005, that was right. And again, that's a lot of the story that Ison's talking about, is the fact that they had a ballot, they rejected the stock transfer, they rejected, because that would have involved quite a major scale demolition, and they rejected that, and then Southwark Council then come in and later on then decide to demolish it. But it's interesting, about the stigmatisation. But what then happens is this, and this is kind of like, this is the irony, don't get senior politicians to come to your estate. Because it's true. Because what
There
then,
wasn't a ballot for that either.
because what then happens is that the media come down to the estate and then they start writing, oh my God, the Aylesbury, the estate from hell, the worst estate in the country. You know, all these kind of very, very lurid stories about, I think it was called Hell's Waiting Room at one time. Was that the Haygate, Jerry?
No, that was here.
It was here.
It
right.
was here, and it was a PR campaign organised by Aylesbury NDC,
Right.
using money from the grant, and there was they spent about £20,000 on this PR campaign, and then
Negative PR.
and then they sacked the PR company, having the damage having been done, and it was a little story about sacking, but
So-
So there was a spate
Right, I
of
didn't
Hell's
realise that,
Kitchen articles.
Yeah, that's it.
Round
So
about
basically then,
2007,
and the problem
2000.
with mass media is they're lazy. So what happens then is that one person will, so the Mail will do a story about Hell's Waiting Room, and then you'll get, you know, the Independent will do a story, you know, and they'll be referring to that actual, previous story. And basically, you know, if you look at the Aylesbury at the time, fear of crime was certainly high on the Aylesbury, but the actual levels of crime in the Aylesbury were actually below the Southwark average. So it wasn't high at all, and in many ways, you know, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I would argue this, you know, if you look at the Southwark council housing at the time, it wasn't anything unusual at all. It's a bit like Jerry Flynn there from the Haygate, same sort of thing about the Haygate estate. Again, you had all these kind of lurid stories. What was the BBC one that they talked, Jerry? There were a lot of them, weren't there?
There was also fictional.
Yeah.
the
That's right.
phenomenon
Yeah.
of using these estates
Yeah.
as backgrounds for all of these,
That's right.
sort of.
That's right. So again, yeah, and on the Aylesbury, you probably remember there was a famous Channel 4 when they used to have the idents. So they had the beginning, and they used to have this terrible film of the Aylesbury estate. This sort of, you know, it looked terrible, and the residents actually campaigned against that to stop them using that and fought back. So just to say then, just come back to sort of the narrative. So what I argue in the book then is that so people do value their homes and communities, but there are these issues around lack of maintenance. There are potential issues around overcrowding, and then there are these sort of stigmatisation issues as well. Residents don't. You know, again, it's generally fairly lurid kind of stories which don't actually really portray what life's probably like. Okay, so the last part of the book then is really thinking about regeneration. So what I do in that then is basically take people through the story of what it's like to live through estate regeneration, starting with the consultation process, and then going through to the actual demolition and rebuild itself. The consultation, and I'm sure this is no kind of great surprise to anybody here, but generally residents' views on consultation were pretty scathing. The consultations that I came across was one up in Northumberland Park, and this is one of the questions that the consultant company asked people. They said something like, would you like to have nice public spaces on the estate? And 90% of people say, yes, I would like to have nice public spaces on the estate. Would you like to have new modern homes? Yes, 90% of people say, I would like to have new modern homes. The consultant company doing this, they use this evidence to say, people living on Northumberland Park estate want to have comprehensive redevelopment and the whole thing knocked down and started again. So the thing that's missing is the opportunity cost. Many of the reports that I looked at, it's quite hard to find the word demolition. It's buried in an appendix somewhere. So actually, and that's what the consultants do. It's kind of like it's a sanitized process. They're not actually saying to you, this is what it could possibly cost you. It's all about this bright new dawn, which is not going to happen at all.
Can I just ask, this term
Sure.
estate regeneration you use,
Yeah.
that means demolition, does it?
No, I mean I should have said that at the beginning. basically, estate regeneration, estate means like social housing estate, but regeneration, it covers a multitude of sins basically. So the most extreme is what's called comprehensive redevelopment, which is demolition and rebuild. So that's the Aylesbury basically. So we're kind of, probably about 2/3, maybe halfway through. So that's at one extreme. Then you can have partial demolition. You can also have infill, so you can take, say, some of the public spaces. So you could, so again, been doing this. They've been taking some green spaces, garages, what have you. You could say, okay, well, the garages that empty garages might be, so you could put more homes on the space basically. And then you've also got what's called refurbishment. So basically, then there's no demolition involved at all, or there's no new building. But essentially then you're improving the various structural improvements. So on the Aylesbury they got rid of the walkways a few years ago. So you can refurbish it. Basically it's kind of like it's reinvesting in the stock. All housing needs to be reinvested in, doesn't it? Just leave it to itself, it will fall down at some point. So you have to reinvest in it. And refurbishment then is basically going beyond the normal kind of maintenance and repairs and having a sort of substantial improvement in the quality of the stock. So most of the book it mainly focuses on whereby the substantial demolition. So that's what
It can mean because I assumed
it can mean refurbishment. Yeah, I looked at estates whereby it was either total demolition or substantial demolition, basically. So yeah. So
Can I ask if you heard
sure.
the term renewal?
Yeah,
Because Lambeth have changed it from regeneration to renewal
Well, that's
now. and
probably
I don't
because
know.
regeneration.
They won't tell me what it means. I think it's because regeneration is a toxic word to them
Yeah,
now, isn't it?
I start the book with that.
Yeah.
I start the book with a quote. The quote is from a woman who was at a meeting I went to up in North London. It was actually Tottenham, saying, I pray to God that they don't regenerate my estate because regeneration has become a nasty word. So renewal is just basically it's another way of doing it.
Yeah.
So consultation, I think, is generally residents were pretty scathing about the consultation processes in many kind of ways. And then what happens is this, and I argue then, and probably I think the best chapter is chapter 9, I think, which is talking about what really happens through the process of regeneration. And regeneration is a misnomer. That isn't what happens at all. What happens is a process of degeneration. That's what happens. So if you think about what I talked about, the idea that residents value certain things and they don't value certain other things, what happens with regeneration is that it flips around. So all of the things that the residents don't like about their estate gets worse. And all of the things that they valued about their estate,
Gone.
it gets eroded.
Yeah.
And this is a perfect illustration of it. So the degeneration happens in several ways. Firstly, it happens in physical terms, because what happens is that the council or the housing association, they disinvest even further in the process of maintenance and repairs. So I was fortunate enough to be able to interview somebody who works in Southwark Council, who was one of my old students, it happened. And she worked on the Aylesbury, the Haygate. And, she basically said, that's kind of, it wasn't, nobody sort of spelt it out. The managers didn't say, don't do that. But it was kind of like an unspoken assumption not to go the extra mile, to kind of like to do the work on the estate. And again, the logic is, well, why would you spend extra money on an estate that's going to be demolished? So,
could interrupt briefly.
Sure.
So the housing officers who are in charge of, the kind of like, if you've got an issue and you want your help with your repair,
right.
Those are the same people who are overseeing the rehousing process and encouraging people to move. So if there's it's a conflict of interest, isn't it?
That is, yeah, sure, yeah. So if residents struggled before the regeneration to get their repairs done, it actually gets worse. And I think again that the Aylesbury is a classic example. But the data, this is not just me saying this, the data bears this out. So again, if you remember, I talked at the beginning about the Decent Homes programme. So I've looked at estates then like Clapham Park, like the Aylesbury, like the Ocean. Actually, so the Decent Homes programme began in 2000, it ended in 2010. The levels of non-decent homes at the regeneration estates were higher than the average for the borough as a whole. So Clapham Park, which I know Joe's from Clapham Park, at the beginning of the regeneration, 90% of the homes failed to meet the decent homes. 10 years later, 69%, which is actually double the Lambeth average. The Aylesbury estate, nearly half of the homes failed to meet the decent home standard in 2015. So what happened is they took these estates out of the Decent Homes programme. That's what they did at Woodbury Down. So what happened at Woodbury Down? I was interviewing up at Woodbury again. This is a big estate. What happened there is, so I'm interviewing people in 2017 who are literally having their new windows and bathrooms fitted because it was taken out of the Decent Homes programme when the regeneration kicked off 15 years previously. So it actually gets worse for people who are living on regeneration estates. So that's this kind of physical decline. You also then get when the building work starts, is that you get the noise, the dust from the works itself, but also because they're going to build on the green space, so that gets removed. So the things that people value. So I had people, quotes from people at West Hendon, for example. A lot of green space at West Hendon. They said that's where our kids used to play out. They can't play out now because it's a building site. So that's the kind of physical degeneration. The social degeneration, and again, this is a good example of it in a way, is that, yes, some tenants will be decanted in the jargon, some leaseholders will sell up, but many won't. They'll stay on, because they like their homes, they like the communities, as does Ison. So what happens then is that their neighbours who they used to know, they go. And then what happens is that you get new faces appearing. Is that in some cases places have been squatted, in some cases then they'll put in temporary tenants, and in some cases then, and once the demolition gets nearer and nearer and nearer, they'll put in property guardians to literally on a licence who can be moved out very, very quickly. So any remaining residents, they're living in a world which is no longer the place that they thought it was. You also have the kind of what I call psychosocial degeneration. You have the psychological wear and tear of all of this. And the other thing that is really important, banged up on about in the book, is the length of time. The length of time. This estate, we've got an NDC 25 years ago, 1998. The NDC began in 2000 here. It was expected to be completed it was a 10-year programme. This is not going to be completed until 2035, if then. Woodbury Down, again, the regeneration began there in 1999. Last year, I went to a consultation at Woodbury Down for the phase 4 of the scheme. It's an 8-phase scheme. It won't be completed until 2035. So, Ison has, this is testimony to an incredible fortitude. To one of the jokes that I sometimes make about this is, apart from kind of like weird academics, who would want to go along to regeneration meetings year in, year out? What normal person would want to do that? This is not life. But and then kind of like the councils. Oh, why don't people engage with the regeneration process? Because they're sick to death of it. They've lived it for year on year and year in, year out. And the other thing that happens as well, and this is one of the things that kind of is really kind of bruising for residents, is that I went to meetings and residents would say, there was a regeneration team will be there from the council or the developer, what have you. And the residents will be saying, back in 2002 when this began, you said that we were going to be moved into new properties, for example, at West Hendon, next to the Welsh, where the water is. This is 2014, 12 years on. And the people sitting in the regeneration officials, they say, well, sorry, we weren't here then.
Yeah. Oh. I think it's
They weren't there.
I think it's deliberate.
And this is a familiar criticism, is that people get made promises, and it's often verbal kind of promises in meetings, to basically say, oh, okay, everything's going to be tickety-boo, it's all going to be fine, don't worry about it, blah, blah, blah.
Informal drop-ins.
Informal
Chat.
drop-ins, chats, don't worry, it's all going to be... 6 months later, those people are not there. The throughput of local authority staff, the housing officers are not there. So you have residents, they're kind of like, they're kind of shouting into a void. And the familiar thing that people said on the estates I looked at was, this isn't what we were promised back in 15 years ago, whenever it was. But there's no accountability, because people aren't there. So this is incredibly, and again, you've got the stress and the strain of living on a building site. And one of the things that really came across on some of the estates was the way that basically there are supposed to be statutory hours of construction work.
No.
8 till 6 on a week, 8 till 1 a week, Saturdays. But that isn't what happens at all. So they often go beyond, they start earlier, they go beyond. So residents then, they're in this constant kind of position of having to complain to the council, take photographs, take videos. And if they don't do that, they're not believed, it didn't happen. So it's a constant kind of like, wear and tear on them. And as I said, this isn't just like, 3 months or 6 months.
Years.
This is years. And no wonder, literally. I mean, one of the things that, several people I interviewed, they just said they were opposed to it earlier on. They just got burnt out. They literally just got burnt out by the whole process. It's too much. Because it's your home as well. It's very, very personal at the same time. But the other thing, the other bit of, to add kind of like, the kind of like the icing on the cake in a way, and this is particularly the case with the Haygate, but also I think the Aylesbury and some of the other estates, is that, so the estates empty out, buildings get boarded up, you get more graffiti appearing. And then you get the film crews arriving. Because, hey presto, we want to shoot our dystopian film where better than Jerry the Haygate estate, which was the scene of Attack the Block, Harry Brown, some of these kind of like, gangster, urban dystopian